The Open Crypto Audit Project. Yeah.
Open Crypto Audit Project. So I don't know exactly what your talk's about, but I do know that it's going to be a lot of good information.
Ken co-founded TrueCrypt.
Well, not TrueCrypt, the TrueCrypt audit. We're not really sure who founded TrueCrypt.
And then somebody can't hire.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and dive in. Thanks, Frank. All right. So what I want to talk about a little bit is some work that's been going on in the applied crypto engineering world, but really with a focus on how it applies to ops, how it applies to security architecture, for development architecture, and then just close with some sort of interesting and emerging work, some promising work that's going on. So just a quick background on me. I think like a lot of people here, I've had a kind of a weird path. So academically, my background's in machine learning and signal processing, comp neuro. I did some work early on at the National Institutes of Health with safety critical system development, and ended up getting into clinical research and building things to do image analysis and capturing EKG for cardiologists to read, and eventually a couple of the different systems we've used have been in, used throughout the world, several thousand sites. But for truly human critical, safety critical kind of systems. And so just as part of doing that, you kind of, get a trial by fire in terms of network security and defense. So I'm not like a CISSP or a CI, Cisco guru by any means, but I do have a lot of experience with sort of network ops and defense. And then a lot of work more recently on applied crypto engineering. So as mentioned, the most recent project is the Open Crypto Audit Project. I'm not sure how much folks are aware of the TrueCrypt audit we did a couple years ago, and then in the last couple of years we've been working with the Linux Foundation, who commissioned a full end-to-end review on OpenSSL. So I think people here generally know what OpenSSL is, but just to say quickly, it's probably one of the more complicated code bases in the world. It runs on dozens of different platforms, lots of different hardware platforms. And if you haven't been following it too much, there was a fairly major refactor that took about 2.5 years to do. Lots of rework, lots of work on the TLS state machine, protocol analysis, memory structures, the API. A major refactor. And so we worked with the OpenSSL team and the Linux Foundation to sort of help look at that code as it was being developed for 1.1. And we've got I guess the public audit's coming out fairly soon on that. So let's dive in. So the focus is going to be on applications of crypto, but I do want to kind of take a step back and then get into sort of some of the broader picture pieces first. So I think this is true for a lot of us, right? So we work really hard at keeping data safe and people safe, and a lot of our work is really misunderstood. I don't know if you follow her. This is a national security correspondent on the Washington Post, who's fairly high profile. She was quoting this testimony by Director Comey. I think this was about a year or two ago. And his quote was, "There's no doubt that the use of encryption is part of terrorist tradecraft now. It's a feature, especially of ISIL's tradecraft." And Matt Blaze, who, if you're not familiar, is one of the more prominent people in the crypto engineering world and did some of the original work on the Clipper chip, had this great response. It's true. It's used by terrorists, also used in critical infrastructure, business, and consumer tradecraft. I thought that was a good retort. If you don't know it, there's a group called the American Enterprise Institute. It's sort of a pretty moderate think tank, maybe a little bit right-wing in D.C., but anyway, a real deep bench of scholars. And this came out, I think, in the fall or summer last year, and this was the title and the headlines that captured it: How Data Encryption Helps Terrorists. You'll note that this particular page is served over TLS, and if you zoom in, this is using modern cipher suites and so on. So I think they did actually go back and kind of change the title and say how it helps terrorists and then how it helps sort of businesses. But, in the content management system at the top, this, the URL, it still reads how data encryption helps terrorists. So a lot of what we do really is trying to work in the constraints of human behavior, right? I saw this around the Super Bowl. I think it was a year ago. I thought it was fantastic. This guy had 27 different cables and hookups and stuff, and they really wanted to watch the Super Bowl, but they couldn't. And so this is what they ended up doing. I think that's brilliant. So before we get into crypto, part of the conversation is about threats and threat modeling. And you probably hear that a lot, and I don't know, maybe there's some SOC people who do that, or architects who do that sort of every day and know this in a more formal way. But I sort of think about real world threats and strange things that we encounter and stupid things that we encounter, like this. I was not expecting that. So IBM Research has, as you can imagine, a fairly large malware and sort of threat analysis group. They did a report on a particular piece of malware. I don't think it was that interesting, really. They published it and they did their whole analysis. You see these things from time to time that kind of make it into the trade press. The author of that particular piece of malware was so annoyed with their analysis, he wrote the author insisting on certain corrections and how they describe things. So it's almost like there's a PR element to some malware authors now, which, is sort of a different way of thinking. Your adversary is literally emailing you. And then, as we all know, if you've ever visited RSA or some of the major security trade shows, product people can sometimes be a challenge. This is a VPN called CyberHost VPN, which, by the way, they have a universal pre-shared key for their VPN users, which I think is CyberHost. Awesome. So on their marketing material, the data you send will be encrypted with AES 256. It might take, and I don't know how many years it is, it might, or it might take 10 seconds. I saw this survey the other day. I'm not sure what the product was. What is that? I'm not sure if I drive a car, right? This is an interesting product. It's a point of sale system called Brigade, but particularly there's sort of an extension or add-on to other points of sale systems, and their whole purpose is high availability and stability and sort of anti-malware. And then when you go to their website, you see that on this particular day for their high availability system, their database was down with a raw Apache error. So good. When we look at systems, particularly complicated systems, good UI is crucial. This is some of the best UI I've ever seen. Message is clear, unambiguous. And a lot of, I discovered about 2 years ago, there's an entire field of security on the economics of security. So, incentive analysis, but also like truly social costs, trying to model the impact of certain failures or other things, both in the consumer space as well as sort of, more high profile. However, I had a nice quote, I thought, which is, and I think this doesn't just affect you and me and the working people with the boss, because if you think about it, everyone has a boss and everyone has time constraints and has a budget. But this statement, I like this quote, but it's really about incentives and maybe misaligned incentives. If you've noticed, like on like a lot of local news stations, maybe their set design's not, super high end, but there's been a fair amount of investment in satellite systems and weather systems and some of the HD kind of broadcasting stuff. And then you get things like this during a broadcast. So that was a consequence of someone making a conscious decision to not look at some particular upgrade or piece of system or something, but anyway. And sometimes with security, the problem is really a failure of communication between users, designers, implementers. I saw this the other day. I thought it was fantastic. So read that text closely. This was someone in a bakery wrote down the instructions, and this is what came out on the birthday cake. At another bakery, a USB thing was given and said, it's here, and so can you make it look like this? Not understanding that there was a picture on the USB that they wanted rendered, but okay. So a lot of what we think we know, we have assumptions as we sort of navigate our way through the world, right? I mean, we're pattern matching, primates, really, right? So there's this artificial divide in sort of corporate IT and maybe enterprise IT in general, that there's open source and there's sort of commercial COTS stuff. It might surprise folks to know that Cisco's core VPN client has OpenSSL at its core. It also runs libcurl, and so those are both acknowledged in the about piece. So that's interesting. And so if you're a company like Juniper, when Heartbleed broke out, this sort of this is sort of an artifact of one of the reasons why it took Juniper 3 weeks just to enumerate the products that they had that had OpenSSL that were affected. It's a complex stack, modern development, right? So I think most folks here are probably security more than developers. But have you ever heard of this FizzBuzz test? It's like a cheesy, classic interview problem. Do you know you can do FizzBuzz in CSS? So if you've ever given grief to someone that they're a CSS developer or HTML5, they work in the DOM, they're not really developers, it's Turing complete. You can do FizzBuzz purely in CSS now, which is both really awesome and horrifying. And in the compiled languages of the web, by the way, we still have fails all the time because of things like this, right? Anyway, back to the threat model. So, what do we really mean when we're talking about this? Step one, you got to know your adversary. We hear a lot of spooky headlines and as stories break. Is your adversary the dolphin or the nuclear sub? I love that picture. In the App Store, both the App Store and the Play Store, I think that's what it's called. There's I think this has probably always been true, but there's an increasing awareness that there's an awful lot of malware and malvertising and unwanted software that does all kinds of sketchy things, including, pulling down contacts and sending them back and doing kind of strange monitoring and stuff. But there's also this gaming of the ranking system. I love this picture. So somewhere in the world, there's someone who's loaded up, I don't know, what are these, 40 different tablets, and they're loading the applications, and then they're ranking them on the Play Store. Okay? You have to know your adversary. You have to also model user behavior, the users that you serve, right? I love that one. Rocks, riptides kill unwary Asian visitors on Australian beaches. Well, there's a sign, right? That had to help a little bit. I love the guy on the left just going for it. The dude on the right taking pictures. The guy on the right's got management written all over him. But these are risk and reward ratios, and sometimes the payoff is totally worth the risk. Look at the face on the little girl. She is ready for action. All right. So, I don't know if you saw this story about 2 months ago. German Telekom, one of the biggest cable providers in Germany, had something on the order of 800,000 home routers that were just owned. In some cases they were bricked, but in other cases they were doing DDoS, they were doing all other kinds of interesting things. So it turns out that you can post to unauthenticated an open listening port, and in the body of what's essentially a form upload, inject soap And this particular piece, with a backspace, you could run any arbitrary command line stuff, including pulling down other payload and then changing, the permissions and then executing it. This particular one was really nasty because it was both sort of beneficial and and not so great. It actually closed other listening ports down so that other worms using the same hole couldn't get to it. And then it put up a firewall so it turned on firewall for the exposed ports on behalf of the people whose routers had been hacked that the telecom didn't. But threats vary, right? So yours is probably not mine. I don't have a lot of nation-state threats. And we do different businesses in different ways. I love that one. I would never be in that group on the left, by the way. That's not my risk ratio. Snake oil. Let's talk about that for a second. This was a great quote by Justin Chu. When explaining security products to people, I find it's usually helpful to start with this diagram. A lot of blinky boxes out there. And this is what the protection that's afforded in many products and many trust boundaries, when maybe this is more realistic for the adversaries we have, right? Humans will always game the system. Always. I'll skip that one. This is one of my favorite images of all time. Yeah, it's blacklisted, not the unicycle. Have you guys seen this O'Reilly generator for pages? How much of our life is spent right there, right? I saw this on Twitter last tax filing season by a guy named Tadigo O'Higgins, who's a real person in Ireland. And I was like, no, you gotta be kidding. They've got a web form that blocks apostrophes, because the only reason you'd have a block for apostrophes is if you worry that somewhere else in your application you're going to render that thing. So I logged on and created an account, and yeah, it's blocked. The problem with blacklists, though, is they're not terribly effective, particularly in the web, right? I mean, 70 different ways to encode the less than symbol. So let's talk about some history. A few months ago, I was evaluating this hardware security module, an HSM. It's a tiny little embedded thing in bulk quantity. I think they were like 25 cents or like $1. I mean, that's not for the FIP certification and all that, but I'm talking about the actual hardware that does key management and has, an actual key crypto engine on it. Anyway, I was looking through the manufacturer's history and some bug reports and stuff, and then I found a few things that were like, they didn't quite fit right. I mean, there were some things on Bug Tracker and on that had CVEs, but it was so vague. But the way it was described made it sound like it's not good. This particular piece of hardware, I eventually dug up, and I found this. So this was the scariest bug I've ever seen. So there was an IPv6 fragmentation buffer overflow. You need not be presenting services. You didn't have to have a web server or a mail server or an SSH port. You just had to be on the network and accepting frames. And you could be owned remotely. Like layer 3. What? That's crazy. Here's the report, and I'll post these online. It's got links at the bottom and stuff. But yeah, so that I was like, so this was a couple years ago, but some similar behavior was sort of observed last year as well in this particular vendor. And I was like, that's scary, but you'd think like we'd handle frame, buffer management like way, way, way back. Well, if you remember, one of the most high profile and one of the rare no auth needed OpenBSD bugs back in 2007, which had roots from IPv4 into the late 90s and early 2000. Totally remotely exploitable just by being on the air. So the point is that this particular HSM was running some weird kind of embedded OS that was sort of handcrafted, and they were reproducing some of the same errors that we saw many, many years ago. And also, I don't want to, this isn't just about a Linux thing too, by the way. At least once a year, I see some really nasty exploit, and the phrase that always catches my attention is all versions of Windows. So, XP all the way forward to 10. So there's something called an MCL extension. I don't know if there are Windows people here. Apparently this was enabled by default for certain flavors of Windows. That's it. That's, you put it in the tag and serve it up, and there you go. Really? I mean, that's not, that's not complicated. And this was, it was buried in some of the multimedia code for all versions of Windows. Anyway, a quick thing too, I don't know if you've been following the stuff on the Java breaks around deserialization. It's a big issue. It's, I'm not sure if the struts, Vaughn a couple days ago was related to this, because I think it was more like a header thing. But, and by the way, just a public service announcement, if you haven't followed it, one of the worst zero-day Java bugs of recent memory came out a few days ago. If you're running Tomcat, and if you've got struts, which is to say SAP, Oracle, pick your enterprise or open source project, you're running struts, if you had that stack, and it was nasty. It was basically full command line, pre-auth, remote, from a header. This is an example of some of the systems that are impacted. And if you follow Oracle, you'll see that literally every 3 months, there's an update for their entire product line. There's 200 to 300 remote execs. And the last year and a half, a lot of these have been around deserialization issues. Anyway, so they're everywhere. You might say, I love this phrase, not my circus, not my monkey, not my problem, right? This is like a Polish idiom, I think, for not my problem. But if our role is in terms of the broader defense of ops in our organizations, should be aware of these things. But a lot of them are pretty basic security hygiene, right? I've got a link at the bottom, but this Praetorian analysis came out recently. This is crazy. 100 different major high-profile breaches, and this was the breakdown in terms of this. So these aren't like complicated, triple flips with all kinds of exploit. This is basic stuff. So you're sitting in your chair and thinking, right, I was told there would be crypto. Let's talk about crypto. All right. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time in crypto. If you're not familiar, I've got a link at the bottom. It's called the Montesano Crypto Palace Challenges. Even if you're not a developer, even if you just, maybe you've never even messed around with Python or whatever, this is a set of increasing challenges. So the first one is basically learn how to base 64 encode a string, and then learn how to do ROT13. And it sort of progresses all the way up. There's a whole series. I think there's 8 major levels. But you can work at your own pace, and you sort of do a problem, and then you see what what other people have done. It's a great way to learn languages, because I think people have done this in, a dozen different languages. Somebody even did an AES implementation in Excel, which I guess you can do that. But this last paragraph is one of the takeaways I want you to have in your mind in terms of crypto. In the real world, if you build a bookshelf and forgetting to tighten down one of the screws all the way, it doesn't burn down your house. But it does in crypto, right? So we can't talk about all the things in the whole toolkit, but I do want to kind of at least spend some time on these. These, in my mind, are sort of some of the top level kind of areas where we've got some pretty decent tools in the toolkit. Network transport encryption, that's SSL, TLS, IPsec, SSH, and so on. Disk and volume crypto, file encryption, memory encryption, data and use encryption, and hardware security modules. So we'll start with the first one. So network transport. I think we know this, but it's important to remind ourselves from time to time what exactly it is that these things provide, what are the security guarantees, and crucially what they don't provide, right? And so I sort of took this in a way backwards. I wanted to see what tools were available, what architecture patterns, what coding conventions, what frameworks and libraries and techniques existed, and then kind of reverse that back to what threats are they addressing? So, right, I think most people know that one of the reasons you use SSL or TLS is preventing network interception, confidentiality of the data. If there's any sensitive information, you worry about credential theft. There's identity theft through OAuth and things like that. Help address authenticated cipher suites. So, just roughly by show of hands, do people are generally aware of what AEAD or GCM ciphers do, or why authenticated ciphers matter? A couple? Okay. Right, so I've got quite a few on that one, but the key point there is integrity. To know that not only is a data stream confidential, but what was sent is what was received. And you think that would be like a solved problem in 2017. It is not a solved problem in 2017 in any modern operating system because of a lot of backwards compatibility. Past session decrypt, so people have heard of Diffie-Hellman and maybe, ephemeral or elliptic curve cryptography, ECC. One of the reasons we have some of those things are if network traffic has been captured and we've got basically a long-lived key and that's been captured, there are techniques so that if there's a point in time capture, you can't go backwards and decrypt other traffic. So we'll talk about that in a second. Data exposures, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that's probably the most important one in terms of confidentiality. And then I was compliance, because compliance in itself is a threat. If you're a contractor and you're working in healthcare, you're working in banking, working with any kind of PII, you've got data on your laptop. If you're traveling and you leave your laptop in the backseat of a taxi, that's either a $3 million problem or it's an unreportable, you don't care problem. And so data in motion doesn't address that particular one, but other types of encryption will. And so in that sense, compliance is an adversary. It is a threat. We do compliance because of health authorities or other regulatory bodies that we hopefully agree are, in place for a good reason. But compliance in and of itself, it can be a threat. In terms of TLS, so this still blows me away. There are nearly 5,000 certificate authorities in Firefox and IE that are transitively trusted. That's crazy. I don't know how well you can see that. I've got the high-res version on the slides I'll post, but this is sort of a map of intermediary certificate authorities with some of the core roots. There are many enterprise organizations, and maybe there's some folks here that work for them, that selectively go through default operating system installs and pull certificates out. Maybe you have no business in China. Maybe you have no business in the Ukraine. Maybe you don't need to have to rely on a Polish certificate authority, or vice versa. Maybe someone in Poland doesn't care about some of the .mil certificate authorities here. I'm not sure I can spend a lot of time on this, but I thought this was interesting. Just by quick show of hands, so host.local domain, is that legit? Have you seen that before as a machine name? Local domain? Yes? Yeah. What's that? No. I mean, in terms of, is it a common convention that you see in server installs or in desktop installs? From my experience, it is. I know that maybe this isn't still the case, but certainly there are many flavors of Red Hat and Ubuntu where local domain is sort of one of the defaults if you don't change things. But if you flip that around, so host.local domain is legit, and it's in fact the default on a lot of operating systems. How about local domain.host? Is that legit, or I don't know? It's legitimate in the sense that I can. The internet authority that handles top-level global domains, but it's not legit in the sense of any meaningful use. So a couple days ago, I actually bought this domain, localdomain.host. It turns out there's like a reserved version of this, which is localhost.host, but all of the variants our free game. This was $9. This will drive your SOC people insane, because if they see this, and also, if we're really evil, we could register a virtual machine on DigitalOcean, which, if you're kind of sleepy and late at night, you're not paying attention, the IP addresses start 192. So you're saying lots of outbound traffic to localdomain.host, which is based on a 192 address, not thinking, it's not the entire /32. We can do some kind of evil things with this. By the way, this is not a problem with the certificate authority, right? Because this is a legitimate domain. If paypal.tk.com is allowed to be a domain, it may be fishy and weaselly, but it's not the certificate authority's problem. It's a legitimate domain. I bring that up because there is a big issue, if you haven't been following it, in terms of certificate authority. So there was this big story with WoSign, and now who's merged with Starcom, just issued bogus addresses for like GitHub and the University of California and other people. And then sort of when, confronted about the problem and their controls and things, there's all this sort of weaselly back and forth. And anyway, they kind of got the nuclear option treatment from the CA browser forum. And so in going forward, WoSign and Starcom certs in many of the browsers just don't work. I've got a link at the bottom, but this is Ivan Ristic's sort of SSL specific threat model, which is excellent and worthy of study. I don't think we've got enough time to go into it now. On SSH, just rough show of hands, how many people like SSH into some quasi-important box at least once a week? Right? Do you know you can do two-factor for SSH, like command line SSH? So I think the PAM module has been available for a while. I didn't know this. There's an open source project that Duo Mobile has that you can add to your machines, and literally you log on either with a key or a password. Hopefully it's a key. And you can literally say, give me a call to verify this. Give me a push notification to this particular phone, or text me a passcode. I thought that's pretty cool. Anyway, worth checking out. And even has like, a crude geolocation on where the request is coming from. All right. So back to the network transport. I mentioned authenticated ciphers and how they help with integrity. Let's take a look at that. So there's a problem with unauthenticated block modes. And by that, what I mean, and this is kind of tied into a lot of issues we see with snake oil, right? I mean, how many products have you seen that said, military grade AES 256, and so it's secure? That it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything because AES can't encrypt a file. AES can't encrypt a sentence. AES encrypts very small blocks. And so what you have to do then is you have to figure out the chunks of data that come, whether they're in a stream and you're dealing with that through some other mechanism, or if you've sort of run out of ciphertext, how do you encrypt multiple blocks? So I would argue that saying I've got AES 256 is almost as useless as saying I get a new car and it's got a V6. Okay. What kind of block mode? What kind of, HMAC? How is it implemented? How are the keys managed? I mean, there's just, it's one small little building block and it doesn't tell us much. There has been like a non-ending series of attacks, successful attacks against SSL and TLS because people do this wrong. They do it very wrong. But this is probably one of the best examples I've seen of why that is. So there's a product, or I don't know if it's open source or what, but what are they called? ZeroDB, right? So this was a discussion about a year ago where there had been some curiosity, because in the crypto world, usually it's common to have peer review and sort of open up, how you do your algorithms and how your protocols work and so on. And I don't know if it was delayed or I don't remember the exact story, but basically a lot of people were really curious but couldn't see how that was implemented. And so they finally opened up some code, and it took folks about 10 minutes who knew their stuff to dive in and said, wait, you're using this particular mode called OFB, but it's not authenticated. So you can have the most strong security strength, 256-bit, whatever, but if it's not authenticated, all I have to do is basically a glorified XOR, and I can change, for example, a cookie of admin 0 to admin 1. Well, that's a problem. All right. So for people who are just, like, okay, but I've got API endpoints to deal with, I've got Nginx, I've got Apache, like, what's the landscape look like? If you've ever configured SSL on a server, you know that there's like a myriad of options. And one of the problems is there's a myriad of options, right? We've seen this before where people are like, should I use SSL v3 or TLS1? Well, 3 is a bigger number, so I'm going to go with that. No. The padded Oracle attacks that were part of Poodle and were part of the whole series of other breaks have basically eliminated SSL as being considered secure. So if you're still running SSL, because you've got legacy products or whatever, it's worth considering because it is fundamentally broken. There is no fix. There's going to be no SSL v4 that addresses that. Because by definition in the protocol, you can have unauthenticated ciphers, including AES CBC. So you can have 256-bit AES CBC, but if it's not authenticated, it can be mangled. In modern browsers with reasonably decent support for, say, Android 4 and older Java clients and things like this, this is probably a more reasonable approximation of what what things look like in 2017 if you're trying to do things reasonably securely. One of the caveats is, though, RSA. So not in terms of RSA certificates, but the key exchange. RSA is deprecated. So TLS 1.3 going forward, RSA not allowed. Not in terms of the certificate, but the key exchange. There are weaknesses and there are continued attacks that look interesting. And so not tomorrow, not in the next 6 months, but in the next couple of 2 or 3, 4 years, if you have any position of influence, RSA is definitely deprecated. So, Diffie-Hellman actually, there are 2 sort of common modes that we see for Diffie-Hellman. One is just in Apache and Nginx world, it's called DHE. If you look here, classic Diffie-Hellman is considered deprecated as well, and is not allowed in TLS 1.3. TLS 1.3, by the way, is still being finalized. It's an RFC, but there are some major content distribution networks. So Cloudflare, Google's global CDN. We're starting to see it more and more. We also see cases where Google at points has to turn things off because you have broken middle boxes. That it's not that we expect them to speak TLS 1.3 because it's still a draft, but we expect them to speak basic TLS negotiation. And one of the things in that exchange is, what do you speak? Here's what I speak. I don't know what that means, so can you do 1.2? That's a completely legitimate way and should be how things are implemented. There was a school system in the DC suburbs called Montgomery County that had hundreds of thousands of problems with with their Androids and or Chromebooks rather, because their middle box, their SSL intercept, just gave it up and said, I can't fix it. So like Google Global had to turn off TLS 1.3 because of, a really large customer like that. But anyway, going forward, consider RSA and classic Diffie-Hellman deprecated. So GCM is one of these things that if you talk to cryptographers, you'll get 10 different answers. It's sort of like, well, it's it's kind of lousy, it's complicated, it's fragile, it's kind of the best we've got, and the implementations on the Microsoft stack and in OpenSSL are pretty decent, but it's not that great. There's a whole history here, as I mentioned. I've got some links to papers at the end, but definitely worth reading. In the real world, you can use SSL as a kind of as an informal kind of thing to mean TLS, but more strictly, it's just TLS. There are some other pieces around TLS, and this isn't, by the way, this isn't just strictly web browser to server. This is API endpoint, these are applications, and so on. So there are, I don't know if you call it extensions, but there are enhancements, there are extra things around classic TLS that people are increasingly putting in place. Strict transport security, saying, if I'm connecting with TLS, don't let me drop back to plain text. Do not allow the browser or the endpoint or the app to drop back to HTTP only. Certificate pinning, certificate transparency, and then the SNI for multiple hosts on a single IP address. SNI, as I understand it, is formally part of the TLS 1.3 standard going forward, so that'll help. If you didn't get any of that, just go to the Mozilla SSL generator, and it has lots of different profiles. I've got other links if you want to dig in deeper. Brief rant about consumer VPNs. I don't know if you guys, how many people follow me on Twitter, but it makes me want to gouge my eyes out. 1 in 6 Android VPNs actually don't even encrypt. The amount of malware that's out there is ridiculous. There's probably, last count, 16 or 17 of the global providers that if you do IPsec, there's a shared common key for everyone. Now, I don't think there's a guy in a van outside your house that's like intercepting you, but there are major parts of Central Asia and the Pacific Rim where major fiber is monitored. And so, as a political mechanism, again, it's about the threat model. If it's your cousin who wants to stream Hulu, go crazy, pay some Bitcoin, whatever, connect from Germany and then don't have to worry about getting a subpoena, for, downloading the latest movie. But if you're a dissident in Tehran or Riyadh, these things matter, and there's so much misinformation and such snake oil, it's just, it's crazy. So anyway, if you Google most VPNs suck, I think I'm like the top second or third hit or something there. I've got a whole list of providers that have done a really lousy job of configuring their systems. And even if you make a case that you're not interested in IPsec VPN, you want to use OpenVPN, if you're willing to take the history of breaks that we've seen on TLS, and that fits with your threat model, that's okay. My argument would be, though, these organizations are still putting users at risk every single day with older clients, and don't seem to care about that. If you want a VPN for yourself and you're slightly techie, check out Algo VPN or Streisand VPN. They're excellent. I don't have a lot of advice in terms of the consumer space for services. One thing I would say is if you look at the reviews, scroll to the bottom of these things, because Torrent Freak, PC Magazine, Network World, if you look at the bottom in small letters, it says many of these products are sponsors of this media outlet. So, if there's not a lot of great information sources out there for people that want sort of objective, unbiased information. There's a thing called I think his handle is something like the privacy guy. It's like a giant spreadsheet that's a Google Doc spreadsheet that's floating around, has, 60 or 80 different VPN providers. What I would say about that is those are all self-report. So if you ask people, do we log? No, we don't log. Have you ever worked with, have you ever gotten any NSLs or any other, intercept requests or government? No, not at all. You're totally cool with us. And people do that. They trust their data. I should mention too, by the way, not only is it not unheard of, it's fairly common that the configuration is so borked that some of the cheaper ones dual home you, so that you're not just connecting there so that you can sort of get through the captive Wi-Fi at the airport or whatever. You're also connecting to your local network, bridging. Awesome. So you're sharing it with like who knows how many different people who can totally see your your inside interface. That's just extraordinary to me. But anyway, that wasn't so brief. So on to a couple other pieces. So disk and volume encryption. I think people know about BitLocker and File Vault and DeEncrypt. Turn them on everywhere. There are really decent GPO policies on Windows that let you manage that if you're not already doing it. It can be a multi-million-dollar problem if you have a device like a laptop that is that's lost, that has PII on it. If the disk is encrypted, it's not even reportable. So, but there are different reasons too. So, but let's talk about servers or cloud servers, for example. Why do you care about this? If you can't control the logical sort of sequence of things with the media, right? So there are cases, I don't know if you know this guy, Marco Amat, he was he was sort of the creator of Instapaper. He had some of his servers seized, not because of anything he did, but because there were other people doing goofy stuff like in the same rack. And so his service provider basically told him one day, he's like, yeah, we had to take your machine because the feds came and took it. It just got swept up. It had nothing to do with him. Who had that chain? I mean, he was sort of a third party at that point, so I'm not sure how that was ever resolved. But there is an issue for civil capture, for potential government capture, but also just mundane things like e-discovery, right? You want to be able to be in a position where if your service provider is subpoenaed, if your architecture permits it, that shouldn't be, that should be transparent to you. You should be able to see that. Most cloud providers are in a co-tenant model, right? I mean, this is certainly true for Amazon and Google. By default now, you don't have to worry so much about physical loss, like when disks die and they go to wherever. You don't have to worry about it in the sense of Google has attested, Amazon has attested to the defense intelligence groups and the federal government, and has had third-party audits that were signed by executives under threat of violating the law. That no, they have a very strict handling process for either repurposing or disposal. The nightmare scenario is sort of the mom and pop or smallish regional either cloud provider, hosting provider that's managing something, and that a disk dies, it gets tossed, or a RAID dies, and some of the disks survive, and then they end up on eBay or Craigslist. So it's an issue if you've got, sensitive data. Content repudiation, I don't think that's as big a deal, but there are people working in kind of, polarized environments, activists and so forth, that want to be able to have architectures in place where they can say, no, that data is not mine. It can't be, it can't be attributed to me. That's, and there are digital identities that go with that. The data at rest compliance is said too. If you think of compliance as its own sort of threat or adversary, this is why you can use these things. So I don't know how many people know about live VM motion, live motion. This is a really cool thing on VMware where you don't have to reboot a server. While it's live running, you can transport the load to another machine. So it's literally doing memory deltas, it's doing CPU deltas, it's doing disk deltas, which is awesome from an ops perspective. But if you think about that, and Google also offers that now too, for the Google Compute platform, and I'm a huge fan of GCP. I think they have some tremendous services and products. But if you think about that, so I'm running a process here, maybe it's a web server, it's some other kind of endpoint or database, and it's got interesting information on it. They're able to live transport that entire stack, memory, CPU, working processes everything to a different rack, potentially to a different data center. Okay. There's another party there that's involved that, might not have been considered as part of your threat model. If you use Oracle or a SQL Server, there's variants of transparent data encryption, partially or property preserving encryption, and so forth. Those are more at a very specific kind of application level, but they address things like a black box custodian. So, for example, you can have very fine-grained silos for access controls, so that even an administrator, in theory, wouldn't be able to see the contents of the system, or in the other case, a rogue or a weak admin. Hardware security models. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Happy to talk to folks later, but the key piece here is that there is usually a physical hardened kind of appliance, often runs Linux or some other kind of lightweight operating system. There's key generation. There are true random number generators, pseudo-random number generators. You can use it for tokens, and it basically addresses. Sorry, one sec. Oh.
Did you lose video?
Yeah. Does anyone have a Mac PowerBook adapter? Old school. Let me see.
Like the right shape and not
Yeah, it's the next big one up. Yeah. I can do shadow puppets or something. No, thanks.
Just shove it in there and duct tape it.
No, I thought my screensaver went, and then I realized my phone was tethering, but it also was pulling down the whole battery.
It's not the right one. Oh, yeah.
It's got to be an 80 watt, I think.
Yeah, I've got an 80.
Do you? Okay, perfect.
Same deal. I got an adapter if you need it.
One of the like old.
There's enough Mac people around.
Oh, I appreciate it. No, I think we're good. Yeah. Sorry about that.
They drain back.
Sorry. We're almost wrapped up. By the way, I have a couple big posters if people have some questions afterwards that might be useful, or you can throw darts at. I'm not sure. Can somebody grab this down there? Can I get a volunteer? Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. Yeah, sorry about that.
So Ken, while that's booting, can I ask a question?
Sure, please.
You mentioned SSH.
Right.
Using 2FA with SSH. Are you a fan of YubiKey or?
Love YubiKey.
Okay.
Love it.
Does everybody know what YubiKey is? No? Some yeses. Google YubiKey. I felt the worst.
Oh. Oops. That's not a message you want to see, is it? %. It died at 19%. Come on. There we go. Tricky thing is, does this work backwards, do you know? I love Apple engineering. That's the only reason I wouldn't consider a new Mac Pro that doesn't have the MagSafe.
You want me to try one of the ones that don't have the adapter?
No, I think we're good. Oh.
So don't you consider one as what?
The new MacBooks have USB-C, so it doesn't have the mag thing.
But you get to buy more dongles.
I got one USB-C.
It's job creation. It's dongle purchase and it's job creation.
And I know we just got a few minutes, but feel free to jump in if other folks have questions. Okay, so that's enough about that. So memory encryption. I don't know if people have seen Tessor, T-E-S-O-R. It's one of the coolest projects I've ever seen. So the Intel and AMD modern processors are so big that the L2 caches are enough that you can actually do encryption in cache. So you can encrypt all of RAM and do real-time decryption in the L2 cache. So that if somebody even did a live pull down of like raw memory in the case of a KVM or Zen, Dev KMEM, right? You pull it down, they get garbage. How cool is that? So Tresor actually was specific for the keys for decrypt. There was another group that I think Facebook bought them about 2 years ago. But anyway, that's what they did. They did live memory encryption in use. I've heard that Facebook is open sourcing that pretty soon, but I'm not sure. This specifically also addresses, and I've seen this for a couple architectures, for that live VMware migration, where either for regulatory reasons or maybe sort of anti-competitive or trade secret or intellectual property. I hate that phrase, but anyway, for those sorts of reasons, you may want to have mitigations for live migration, and so memory encryption is one of those possibilities. So putting it all together, so these are kind of the top high-level things. I don't know if you know his work. Ange Bertolini is sort of the guru of polymorphic file types. So, do you guys know this journal, Proof of Concept or GTFO? Oh, if not, you have to check it out. So they have all these interesting, unusual hacks and things. Anyway, Ange is one of the people that worked with the SHA-1 break team to do PDF collision for SHA-1, so that you have two different documents, but they share the same SHA-1. But he's also sort of infamous for having a file which is both a PDF and a legitimate HTML file and a legitimate JavaScript and a legitimate GIF. But anyway, he helped with the graphics design on this and came up with a couple other sort of things. This is sort of a mind map, which kind of represents a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, and he kind of went crazy with it too. This is like the high-tech sort of, circuit board model. And like I said, Ange is just, he's out there. So, the file I've got, which is a legitimate PDF, there's also a GIF version, but you can do this. So, you can say script source equals mymap.gift or script source equals mymap.js. It's the same file, just change the extension so the hashes are the same. But it's a polymorph, right? So, or a polyglot, I should say. So if you download the GIF version of this, you can also, it'll do a pop-up box that says hello. It's nothing dangerous, but anyway, I thought that was kind of cool. Quickly, some other interesting work to take a look at. I love this slide. It's formal software verification. Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Google are all spending significant amounts of money doing refactoring of their TLS stack. If you haven't followed, Amazon has something called S2N for, I think it's signal to noise is what it stands for. But they've replaced OpenSSL as the wrapper for libcrypto. And I think they've cut the size of it down to maybe a tenth of what it was. But they brought in people who do formal software methods, formal verification methods, like mathematical analysis of the security guarantees and properties, as have Google with boring SSL, as has Microsoft with their next generation TLS stack. So there are some really interesting developments that way. And it's not just like an R&D project. I mean, in the case of Amazon, they've rolled it out globally, and Google has as well with the boring SSL stuff that they're doing. There's also, I think I've got a link at the bottom. Have you guys heard of the DARPA challenge with the trusted software? So the headline was sort of goofy and a little misleading. Basically, the headline came out unhackable drone. The real story behind that was these DARPA awards. There was a team that spent about a year and a half, and from the ground up, they wrote in a memory-safe language, formally verifying the security properties, a flight control system, the operating system itself, the file interfaces, the GPS, the remote controls, the lift, everything. And formally verified this entire, it's a toy drone, it's like this big, top to bottom. And so it's not really to say that it's unhackable, but it's 99% less surface area than traditional software projects of that complexity, with memory-safe languages, with complete analysis of the protocol, including the key exchanges and the handshakes and things. That's pretty awesome. Obviously, it costs a fair amount of money and lots of time, but there are some interesting things in that regard. And so, but that's my point: is that Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple as well, their own internal products, they're going through these same kind of practices. Just a couple of parting thoughts. I'm happy to talk all day about crypto, but a lot of what we do comes back to first principles, right? Security, hygiene, trust the supply chain, and the root of trust. One of the CISOs from Microsoft, John Lambert, had this a little while back, and I thought this was great. 98% of the threats they're seeing in the Microsoft Global Threat Center are macros. I think some of us sort of know that, like, we have all these, it's fun to talk about nation state stuff. It's fun to talk about the, the WikiLeaks hacks and all that kind of, but this is the boring reality of the world. There are all kinds of, GPO policies and things that can be put in place. I'm not a Windows guy, so that's sort of the extent of what I've seen, but there are some interesting things that way also. And I don't know if people are broadly aware of Nano or Core. So in the new generation of Azure, Microsoft Azure, the cloud platform, they've launched Nano, which is, I think it's like a couple hundred megs, but it's a GUI-free, highly minimized version of Windows Server with all the the Linux subsystem things built in as well. So anyway, maybe worth a look. And I guess one of the other things I would say is just remember your threat model. Are you defending against this or this? Or are you defending against the woe signs of the world? This is one of the biggest takeaways too, I hope, which is your operating system out of the box already has a deep chain of trust, which you may not even be aware of. And applications like Chrome sometimes can ignore those and use their own set of roots of trust. Applications all the time have their own trust stores with CAs embedded as well. You may have on one system literally dozens of different certificate authority stores, which may never get updated. As I said, this relationship with these intermediaries are complicated, but people are starting to do some smarter things too. Like I said, pulling some of the ones that are less relevant for your particular use case. I saw this other thing too, which I thought was interesting. It's a small little UI technique or tactic, but I thought this was really neat. So why don't a lot of other online systems have something like this, where it's not an open-ended, my Pinterest is, is okay to use Twitter or whatever, but no, with explicit timeouts. Little things like this are going to make, I think, a huge impact. We see also there's a technology called Thinkst with canaries. Are people familiar with this? This is like one of the. I feel like it's an insider secret that more people should know about. It's a pretty simple concept. It's a small little box. You drop it on your network, and basically it listens for scans. If in a segment of your network there's no legitimate reason for you to ever be scanned, to have an SNMP or a port sweep for Oracle's listener or SQLD, MySQLD or whatever, if it sees that, it chirps like a canary through messages or push notifications or whatever. But the other thing that they've got, which is kind of neat, is they've got dummy documents in FTP that are Word, Excel, I think PDF too. So maybe folks are aware of this. I wasn't until fairly recently. There are beacons that you can put in those documents that just looking at them calls home. And so there's a whole infrastructure they've set up where you can put particular things in place, which basically it's like a tripwire of sorts where there's no reason that these should be scrutinized or opened or looked at. There's no legitimate use, and so when they are, it's likely there's some kind of intrusion or otherwise maybe it's an authorized scan. Things like that. They're inexpensive. They're not complicated. They're kind of first principle things. Will outdo some of these $200,000 Blinky boxes in many cases. As I said, blacklists, whitelists, these things are crucial. If you guys have ever seen the movie Apollo 13, this is one of my favorite lines when things went really bad. So that's a little bigger version of that. And this is how adversaries work, right? Don't care how you think your network diagram looks. You don't care how your handshake protocol should look. Maybe I'm going to send 8 gigs worth of JavaScript probes to go enumerate a script tag, because once I've got that, it's basically a Caesar cipher for the rest of your payload. If a lot of this seems like it's outside your lane, it's, you sort of recognize some of the terms and phrases, but it doesn't, it's not really your area. This is how people who work in this all the time, I go to crypto meetings, and there are people that are like, I'm not an academic crypto guy. Other people are like, I don't do protocol analysis. Other people are like, I'm not an implementer. People are like, no, I don't do S-table stuff. If there are imposter syndrome that I see by some of the best in the field, then it's okay to recognize, there are things that don't make sense. It's that collection of these different areas. Your black box is what someone else does all the time. When the whole Apple iPhone thing came out, I thought this was a great thing from Matt Blaze. If you followed this Confide messaging app story the last few days, it just got ripped apart when it actually was got peer reviewed by people in the security engineering world for a whole lot of reasons. But one of them came down to, it's like Telegram. It's what I call pinky promise as a service. We promise not to do bad things, but we could. Versus signals protocol analysis, which is, it doesn't matter who the intermediary is. It doesn't matter who's in the middle. It's not a policy promise. It's a technical constraint. So as you look at solutions, sometimes you have to make policy, you have to sort of adhere to policy or accept those limitations. But if ever possible, it should be technical limits. And I'll leave it with that. Open up for questions, too, if folks want to.
Question. What do you think about FIPS 140?
About what?
What are your thoughts about FIPS 140?
Yeah, it's one of the... So the question is about FIPS 140, my thoughts. It's one of the most misunderstood things. FIPS isn't about security. FIPS 142 is about correct implementation of very narrow questions. Are keys managed in a particular way? Are ciphers and MACs and hashes computed in a certain way? Do they comport with test suites? There have been a graveyard of FIPS 142 products that were just completely owned. But that's not what it's trying to address. What it's trying to address is you sort of crypto created by your cousin, right? It's trying to address, were the primitives constructed properly? Where there is a big problem with FIPS is in the federal world, where it sort of limits what it limits what we can do as new attacks are seen and new problems are recognized, because it's got such a slow timeline for revalidation. I think it has a useful purpose, but I think it's been pretty questionable for global security, frankly, because a lot of people in this room may not care what the federal government standards or certifications are, but Fortune 500s do, and the defense world does, and what trickles down there goes into all kinds of things, including consumer products. So I think it's good that there's a group of experts and third party that can attest to to the way that certain primitive constructions are done. I think it's really bad that a lot of people distill all that down to, well, FIPS 142, it's got the stamp, so it must be secure. Or we can't touch it because it's FIPS 142. It's the human element, right? Anybody else? I've got 2 posters. All right.
Smart question, get a poster.
And I'll leave these, the links up too on the back of the page too. And this is how to reach me. All right. I appreciate it. Oh, one last one.
So what's the next great project for the Open Crypto Audit? So, right, first you guys did quality, next it was LibSSL.
Oh, OpenSSL. Right. Right.
What's the next big thing?
I'm not sure. There are things that weren't specific to us, but sort of in the community that we run with. So there are people who've helped OCAP and who are advisors who've worked with the Linux Foundation and some other groups. Google's actually pouring, to their credit, a lot of resources into things like verifiable crypto, alternative, smaller, newer libraries. One quick thing. So I don't know how many people are familiar with Go as a language. The short version is some of the people who created it came from AT&T Labs that did C originally. It's basically maintained by Google. It's an open source project. I think it's been around for like 8 or 9 years now. I mention it because it's used by Cloudflare and Netflix and Amazon and large parts of banking increasingly so. And one of the interesting things they did was they completely rewrote the TLS stack and they rewrote the certificate parsing. So, I didn't have pictures of it, but there are myriad ways that you can have a web certificate. And they are actually recursive. And there's all these weird, goofy, like rarely understood and rarely implemented options. So you can say, I'm foo, but I trust bar. Bar trusts Baz. Baz trusts Bip. Bip trusts foo. And get these like weird recursions. You can also, and also the encoding, the way that the letters and numbers are represented is so complicated and overly, it's like a Rube Goldberg thing. There's been a whole series of things. If you're interested, you can search for Frankencerts. One of the things we did with OpenSSL, by the way, is we looked at over 2 million certs in the field that were either kind of weird or otherwise kind of constructed strangely. But this gets to what are some of the other big things. I have nothing to do with Go, but you're seeing things like Go with an ASN parser that's 200 lines of code versus thousands and thousands of C with Perl generated assembly, which, is complicated. So, I mean, I think there's an appreciation by a lot of organizations in terms of memory safe systems, modern languages, SQL injection, and XSS by default. You can't do in Go. You have to go out of your way. Same with Rust. You have to go really bend over backwards to make that possible because of the way the core standard libraries are written. So I think there are some promising things like that. That stuff with DARPA, with the drone, there's going to be a lot more of that on the horizon. Mudge with his CyberCL Labs, I don't know if folks have followed that project, but it's basically kind of it's like a consumer reports version of like a cyber assessment, like a minimum baseline, basically. It's meant to address things like 1.4 million webcams running around the world on the internet with full remote root, baby cams, this kind of stuff. So, I mean, I think over time there's going to be more of that. And it's going to start in the federal world, it's going to start in the defense world. These are things that are going to be required as baselines going forward, and I think it's going to benefit all of us. All right, thanks.